Bon, bienvenue aux deuxième journée du colloque Les normes de la violence. On a 3 intervenants qui vont parler ce matin. D'abord, on est très content d'accueillir Miguel Mellino. Après, Laurent Mucchielli, il va parler, et Diego Sardina, il va clore ce colloque. Il va être le dernier intervenant. Donc, je vais changer en anglais parce que l'introduction pour Miguel est en anglais. Miguel Mellino is lecturer on post-colonial studies and inter-ethnic relationships at the University of Naples, L'Orientale. He is the author of Stuart Hall, Cultura, Razza e Potere, Cittadinanza postcoloniale, Appartenenze, Razza e Razzismo in Italia e in Europa. So post-colonial citizenship, belonging, race, and racism in Italy and in Europe. And just translating his titles, he's written also a book called Postcolonial Critique, Decolonization, Capitalism, and Cosmopolitanism in Postcolonial Studies, which is translated into Spanish. And also a book with Stuart Hall, Culture and Power, Conversations on Cultural Studies, that was also translated into Spanish. And finally, a work called Post-Orientalism, Said, and Postcolonial Studies, published in 2009. He is the editor of the Italian translation of Frantz Fanon's Écrits politiques pour la Révolution africaine and L'an 5 de la Révolution algérienne, and also of Césaire's Discours sur le colonialisme. Thank you, Miguel.
Thanks to you for the invitation. Just from the beginning, I will propose a name, just as we are talking about names. I will propose a name to interrogate what can be called the contemporary post-colonial French and European condition and its inherent forms of economic, social, cultural, and political violence. This name is Necro Politics. Necro Politics. As many of you might know, necropolitics is a concept proposed by Achille Membe in a relatively short article of 2003. I must say that this article is not very deep, in the sense that he's very contradictory sketching out this concept. But I decided to, I found it very suggestive what he was trying to say by this concept. I know it's a concept that must be reworked on. So I believe that necropolitics could be a very useful concept trying to understand not only the colonial past in our post-colonial present, that is the lingering colonial fracture at the base of contemporary forms of ethnic apartheid in Europe, but also, I hope, some of the limits of the European radical white left and white Marxism. White Marxism. I use this phrase, white Marxism, deriving it from a very well-known book called Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson. But it's not important here in the way in which I use it. I hope will be clear afterwards. So I hope, I believe this concept could be very interesting as a form of critique of the limits of the European radical white left and white Marxism, especially in their critical approach to contemporary neoliberal capitalism in Europe. My perception is that the European white radical left is still incapable of taking race and racism, and of course anti-racism, seriously. And seriously, for me, means to grasp race and racism as structural, symbolic, and material feature of our present condition, and not only as mere surrogates of other more central social and political struggles. I don't know, my impression is that in the critique about migration, or not only migration, about capitalism, about neoliberalism, by many of the important authors or sectors of the radical European left, race and racism are always taken as something which is defect or something other most important than them. I hope I will clarify this going ahead. So, retrieving Membe's concept of necropolitics appears as a choice induced by a specific political urgency of our present. As Europe is more and more gripped into economic depression, we know racist violence and racist discourse are becoming one of the more powerful dispositives to tackle, govern, and pleasing the crisis. Pleasing the crisis is a very known phrase by Stuart Hall and one of his best-known books. It's office here to focus not only on present aggressive forms of popular racism emerging in almost every European society at the day, or on the increasing concept of openly racist political parties and coalitions, fostering anti-immigration on anti-Islamic political agendas, but mainly on institutional and democratic racism, fostered both by the liberal and institutional left and by the EU regime of migration management. I used before openly racist to define these political parties or coalitions which in the public debate or in media debates are always defined as xenophobe or populist. I don't know why there's a problem to call them openly racist, because they are racist. Why we use xenophobe? Why we use populist to define Pegida, Le Front National, La Lega in Italy? I think here there's something very important, because one of the things I am trying to say is that in Europe there's a serious problem to name racism for what it is, and this is a kind of symptom. I not agree also to speak about Islamophobia today. What does it mean, Islamophobia? It's like xenophobia. It doesn't mean anything. The problem is racism, and what we have regarding Islamophobia is the return of racist anti-Muslim racism, which is not the same. As, for example, one French anthropologist underlined this, Didier Fassin. Coming back to institutional racism in the EU, I am thinking here, given the so-called refugee crisis, also to humanitarianism, to what Didier Fassin has called humanitarian reason, which can be defined as one of the most powerful forms of contemporary institutional and democratic racism. And yet, if economic depression and crisis are triggering a new politicization of racism, theoretical and political anti-racist practices, even the more radical, seems to me, from my point of view, undermined by an evident impasse. We don't have an effective anti-racism to combat this politicization of racism. Not that there are not important, recurrent, and visible forms of anti-racist resistance and struggles. The problem is that dominant forms of European anti-racism, discourses, theories, political practices, are still revealing themselves more under the guise of ethics than of politics. What I am trying to say is that anti-racist struggles and discourse and theories are centered more on a moral precept of solidarity between different racialized, between brackets, social groups and subjects, than on solid theoretical epistemological premises about the role of race and racism in colonial and post-colonial capitalist modernity. We have here a paradoxical political lack. While racism is appearing always more as a dispositive at the core of neoliberal processes of citizenship hierarchization, anti-racism often becomes a mere accessory or ancillary or external element of a political agenda centered on other specific arguments and struggles. I took this definition, accessory and ancillary, from Fanon. Fanon speaks in one of his books that he didn't agree with an analysis of racism which tackles it as something ancillary and not central to the development of the system. Think, for example, about the main political agenda and counter-narrations of the crisis of the European radical left. They are urging and demanding us to reimagine collective and transversal forms of subjectivation from struggles against austerity, debt, precarity, borders, financial violence, commodification of the commons, and so on. Anti-racism not only arrives always at the end, but it is usually confined to a kind of basements of politics, to a marginal space destined to gain any temporary centrality only in front of the cyclical reemergence of explicit forms and discourses of racist violence or aggressions or physical aggressions. And yet, important parts of the European population, migrants, post-migrants, refugees, second generations, valuers of the whole continent, Black Europeans, Muslim Europeans, Afro-Europeans, East Europeans, experience racism daily and materially as one of the primary dispositives of their proletarization, differential inclusion, or even exclusion. Otherwise speaking, for a consistent part of the European population, of the today European population, it has always been very clear that in Europe, the production of population, to say it in Foucauldian terms, has been historically dependent on different spatial, temporal articulations of a racializing dispositive of government. This racist and racial dispositive, of course, has its historical roots in the colonial past, in the government of the colonies, or, to say it better, in the historical intertwining of capitalism and colonialism. But the point here is that for white Europeans, it's very difficult to think of racism as a structuring structure. I use here Bourdieu's definition of habitus, structuring structure. It's very difficult to think of racism as a structuring structure of class, material, and symbolic inequalities, of uneven access to social forms of hierarchies and privilege, of struggles around not only material conditions of life, but also of cultural identity struggles. In mainstream left discourse, racism remains always unnamed, in a second place, or exclusively associated to sovereignist, nationalist, or regressive right-wing parties. Or even anti-racism is conceived of as a part of a cultural struggle. And this is not the way in which racialized groups and subjects experience racism daily. It is not difficult to understand that this ancillary conception of racism depends on its connotation as a residual, non-modern, irrational phenomena, as something external or alien to dominant or advanced neoliberal, between brackets, forms of capital accumulation. This is a problematic approach, for it is completely internal to the neoliberal order of discourse. As we know, neoliberal hegemonic discourses are recalcitrant to consider racism as something structuring public and material life, the material constitution of contemporary societies. They confine racism to a private and individual domain, to a mere prejudice or ignorance. Actually, as we can call it, pure neoliberal reason, so to say, usually mobilizes race and racism to mark a boundary or a difference between the racist, colonial, not completely liberal past and the post-racial liberal present. And this is very clear, for example, in the US today. Past and the post-racial post-racial liberal present in societies by now produced by colorblind technologies of government centered on managerial, meritocratic, entrepreneurial empowerment of social subjectivities, by biopolitics, we could say, using Foucault again. Significantly, many of the recent critiques of contemporary neoliberal rationality, think, for example, about Dardot et Laval, about David Harvey, Wendy Brown, and so on, do not consider racism as one of the central tools of its hierarchization of citizenship, or of, just to retrieve Wendy Brown's original expression, as a tool of de-democratization of society. My point is that an effective anti-racism cannot operate between the very rules of what has been called post-racial discursive dominant order. Here I am talking about, of course, the US with the election of Obama, but in continental Europe, especially in France, we had another situation. But now I think that we have this very interesting convergence in the sense that, in a way, post-racial racism, French post-racial racism anticipated something that what is going on now in the US. Even though it is difficult to adjectivate contemporary European neoliberal discourse as post-racial, since in continental Europe, with Britain as a partial exception, there has never been a serious assumption of race, colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, not only as constitutive social phenomena of European history, but also as constitutive elements of European cultures and archives of knowledge. Summarizing, a deracialized anti-racism, and by deracialized anti-racism, I mean here an anti-racism does not take seriously race as a material discourse, and not only as mystification or deceit or cultural prejudice and so on. And I think that these are the limits of most of the sociology, European sociology of racism, for example, of Taguier, Vieux-Viorca, but also Balibar. This deracialized anti-racism ends up not only to betray a white liberal and colonial unconscious, but mainly to misunderstand the very terms of any political recomposition in contemporary Europe. We have to decolonize anti-racism. Racism is not only a question of simply capital superexploitation or of housing problems, or not to find good jobs, or that some segments of French population have been abandoned, as Manuel Valls said, or of mistaken social policies. It's quite the contrary. As, for example, Bancel, Lemaire, and Thomas put it in a recent article about these facts, we need to decolonize social and theoretical political practice. And I would add, we have to decolonize our gaze just to rethink racism and anti-racism. So, recalling the necropolitical dimension of neoliberalism as a technology of government could be a good starting point to get out from this impasse. Membes proposes his concept of necropolitics as a furthering development of Foucault's work, especially in Society Must Be Defended. It could be argued that Membe is trying here to re-elaborate some aspects outlined in Foucault's theories on the relations of racism, modernity, colonialism, and sovereignty, but neglected both in his following works and in most recent Foucauldian analysis. But what does Membe intend by necropolitics? Very briefly, for Membe, modernity was at the origin of multiple concepts of sovereignty, and therefore of the biopolitical. Necropolitics must be thought of as one of the products of the encountering of Western modern sovereignty with colonial populations. More specifically, necropolitics, as a dispositive of dominance and production of populations and territories, is the result of the intertwining of sovereignty with race. We have here a very important difference, for example, between Membe's approach to modern sovereignty and that, for example, of critics like Wendy Brown in Walled States or Undoing Demos, but also from Giorgio Agamben, whose critiques foster a unique and undifferentiated concept of sovereignty. For Membe, instead, there are some figures of modern sovereignty whose ultimate end was and is not the creation of political community, but the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. And such figures of modern sovereignty are far from a piece, I quote Membe here, far from a piece of prodigious insanity or an expression of rupture between the impulses and interests of the bodies and that of the mind, but they were moved by Western civilizational logic and ratio. The colony has been the place in which the violence of the state of exception operated at the interest of civilization, and, as it has been shown many times, it was the place, par excellence, in which sovereignty clearly consisted in the exercise of power beyond the law, in which the state of exception was clearly the rule, to say in Carl Schmitt's well-known assertion. Necropower, therefore, refers to the exercise of power in colonial spaces, and where, keeping this definition in mind, an important part of the population has the status of mere living deaf people. So, necropower refers to the exercise of power in colonial spaces, and where an important part of the population has the status of mere living deaf people, zombies, as Fanon called them in The Wretched of the Earth. What matters here is that in colonial context, necropolitics materializes as a system of government centered not only in the production of life, just to quote Foucault, but also on the production of terror, violence, murder, and death of a part of the population, physical death, but also social death, racism, slavery, and servant labor forms. I get lost a bit. Centered not only in the production of life, but also on the production of terror, violence, murder, and death of a part of the population as the minimal condition of the whole social biopolitical productivity. I repeat this because it's very important. Necropower in colonial context materializes as a system of government centered not only in the production of life, but only in the production of terror, violence, murder, and death of a part of the population as the minimal condition of the whole social biopolitical productivity. And by death and terror, I mean here, of course, physical death, but also social death, as racism is a form of social death, as it was slavery, but also servant labor forms are forms of social death. For Membe, hence, we should think of necropolitics as the constitutive reverse of Western liberal and biopolitical technologies of government. Today we can say of neoliberal and regarding to the birth of the EU as a political system, also ordoliberal. And here, for example, I have in mind, but I don't have time to develop this point here, to what has been called in Germany and other countries of North Europe as the Gastarbeiter system, who was the first managing migration system management. Which was based also in bio and necropolitics together. There are two other aspects of the dynamics of necropower which, from my point of view, are very interesting and useful to complicate complicate, so to say, our schemes or ways of seeing of the post-colonial condition in Europe. But also, for example, the tightening of the control regimes of borders of migration management within the so-called refugee crisis, even though, as we know, the goal here is never the complete arrest of migration, the so-called Fortress Europe. In the first place, drawing on Fanon and Arendt, members recall us that necropolitics, projecting the discourse of race on societies, it is not only segmenting them, but it divides, separates, hierarchizes humanity. It is producing at the same time, hence, spheres, segments or territories or of reciprocal exclusivity. It might be interesting to quote here the idea of non-being zones coined by the decolonial thinker Ramon Grossfogel, although his scheme is more rough and less suggestive than Membes' one. Anyway, necropolitics and biopolitics are at the base of the material constitution of what I call striated or dual societies, spaces and territories. The role of necropolitics is to interrupt free circulation between spheres and subjects in society, and thus, incidentally, also between the different niche of the labor market. It is precisely in this sense that it has an active role in the hierarchization of citizenship, which is at the base of neoliberal technologies of government. Finally, the necropolitical dimension of power tends to constantly enroll bodies into a moral economy machine. Moral economy was a term by Edward P. Thompson, reworked by Paul Gilroy. The necropolitical dimension of power tends to constantly enroll bodies into a moral economic machine hinged on massacre, war, violence, repression, incarceration, surveillance, punishment, segmentation are its main tools. It is for this, concludes Membe, drawing on Gilroy's work in the Black Atlantic, that in context dominated by necropower, and Membes here has in mind the plantation, urban colonial ghettos, and the apartheid South Africa, and also Palestine today, or the refugee camps, and of course we could add many more of them, migrant hotspots, migrant detention centers, illegalized migrants, urban post-colonial ghettos, and so on. It is for this, concludes Membe, that in context dominated by necropower, death might be conceived as a liberation from terror, slavery, racism, and nonsense lives. And here also the African American tradition could say many interesting things to what is happening today in Europe. Of course, the situations are not quite the same. Summarizing, in contexts like this, the desire of death appears as a direct or indirect product, so to say, of material conditions of suffering, pain, exploitation, desubjectivation processes experienced daily by racialized subjects. Racism is not only racism. It means, as a social phenomena, not only exclusion or worse, to be discriminated, as many sociologists and philosophers used to talk about it, and Rancière is one of them. Or it's not merely not to find good jobs. This is a wide perception of the effects of racism. Racism has profound ontological effects on racialized subjects. As Fanon suggestively describes it, the experience of racism, when racism works as the pillar of a whole way of life, to retrieve Williams' expression, is very close to that of social death. It might be interesting to recall here one of the most suggestive definitions of racism I found. I am thinking on the one proposed by Ruth Gilmore, a geographer and one of the many voices of the Black Lives Matter movement. For Ruth Gilmore, racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death in the context of diverse but yet interconnected geographies. I repeat it, racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death in the context of diverse but yet interconnected geographies. It's a definition taken from one of her most important books called Golden Gulag, Prisons, Surplus, Crisis and Opposition in Globalizing California. And it's all about the exclusion of big portions of the black population. So here we could open up a little parenthesis. From my point of view, I believe that this definition of racism, together with what we are saying about necropolitics and its effects, might give us a suggestive background to locate our present discussion on the names of violence and, of course, of what is going on, not only in France, Belgium, but also all over Europe. Of course, I do not intend to assert that suicide or social massacres can be read as forms of political resistance. The topic is more complex, but they may have something of a not intended boomerang effect of Republican assimilation policies and its racial, but never recognized as racial management of its population and territories. Assimilation was incarnated, as we know, in the modern theology of the state. The French Republic, was and is conceived of as a historical incarnation of a kind of transcendental subject: modernity, reason, universalism. Force, violence, and colonial violence are constitutive of Frenchness and of republicanism as they are conceived, as they are in the moment, as they are conceived of as derivative discourse of modernity and civilization as a transcendental subject. I use this phrase, derivative discourse, from Partha Chatterjee's well-known book about nationalism in India. No wonder, then, if the civilizing mission has historically been at the core of the Republican identity. What assimilation presumes is that other cultures and other subjects are failed cultures and subjects. They need to be repressed, just as they are cultures. It may be interesting to compare, for example, if we it may be interesting to compare two films that, in a way, one anticipated what happened in France, and the other one was a kind of answering to what happened from two different points of view. The first film is Dipan. I don't know how many of you watch it, and you know how the end of the film, when one of the main characters decided to do an act of radical violence against one of the neighborhood in which he lives in the banlieue. Of course, this is only a representation of the banlieue and many other things. I don't want to associate strictly banlieue to violence. That's not my point, my intention. But the interesting aspect of the film as a representation, not as true, is the fact that it represents assimilation as a kind of forced violence on subjects, and put subjects in a kind of limbo. And this generates ulterior violence. Francophony is the other film, and could it be thought of as a kind of Republican answer to that film and to many of the things that we are debating now? I don't know how many of you have seen Francophony by Alexander Sokurov, which is a very interesting director, but he's not this film, because this film, Francophony, he tries to defend the essence of the Republican ideas. He tries to defend it as what they are, ideas of égalité, fraternité, and liberté, from a presumed violence which is outside these ideals. The film is constructed about this idea, no? The fact that we have these ideals, but many people during history have tried to exploit them in racist and political ways for their own gains. So I think it may be interesting to have these two films in mind to reflect about our topics. In this sense, I think Necro Politics could be conceived of as the past and present reverse of the French Republic, and the Republic may be the French name to white supremacy. So, why I put this is a piece of an interview with Jacques Rancière in the Le Nouvel Observateur. It's very strange because I have nothing with Rancière. I always read him and I use a lot his philosophy or some of his inputs. But this interview is completely out of point because in the whole interview he doesn't speak of racism. In France, there's only discrimination, not racism. Okay? That for me is not the same. And the most intriguing for us is this thing. I don't know if you can read in Spanish. Is the last four sentences, the last four lines, in which he said that today we are at the culminant point of a counter-intellectual revolution which progressively has expulsed from the French nation its heritage, its revolutionary heritage, its revolutionary, socialist, workerist, anti-colonial, and resisting heritage to reduce them in a white and Christian nation, only recently. For Rancière, it's only a process of the last 30 years, the neoliberal counter-revolution. I think this is totally out of the point. Yesterday, Katia talked about the Black Jacobins in Haiti, and the problem was the same 200 years ago. So it's not a fact of the last 30 years. I think that there's a structural contradiction in what Republic is for French and European people, and of course of its coloniality. Focusing attention on the necropolitical dimension of contemporary global neoliberal capital, and hence on its colonial heritage, may help to correct, interrupt, or decolonize a certain kind of Foucauldian approach to neoliberal governmentalities, which tends to conceive the rationality at the core of this technology of government as primarily centered on the mobilization of life, on the so-called life put to work, that is, on the production of freedom, laissez-faire, security, but security intended here as mere surveillance and not racialized surveillance, and all other optimal conditions necessary to the free concatenation of competition and self-entrepreneurship within populations. It is important to reassert that stressing the necropolitics of neoliberalism does not mean here simply to recall the sovereign limits of neoliberal and biopolitical technologies of governments, but it is intended to underline the inherent dependence of biopolitical governmental processes from necropolitics. This dependence achieves its sense only by taking seriously what Aníbal Quijano has called the coloniality of capitalist global modern power, and hence the effects of colonialism and race on the material constitution of the present, mainly in Europe. The theoretical stake, then, is to consider necropolitics as the constitutive reverse of modern sovereignty, but also of liberal and neoliberal and also ordoliberal technologies of government, and not only as a mere supplement or exception, which means not a central aspect of advanced cognitive capitalism. More directly, I would suggest to think the hierarchization processes at the core of the present neoliberal logic of capitalist accumulation from this double dispositive of government, biopolitics and necropolitics, where the life put to work, the production of freedom, security, laissez-faire, competition, and self-entrepreneurship of one part of the population is not only intricately tied up to, but depends on the segregation, terror, police repression, and surveillance, inferiorization, servant exploitation, incarceration, and finally social and physical death of another one. Racism, the police and institutional racist violence, securitarism, militarization of territories and borders, the development of the so-called penal state or punitive neoliberal state, urban, cultural, and social segregation are not mere external, secondary, residual, or sovereign limits of neoliberal governmentalities, but they are dispositives at the core of these technologies of government, something that in many of Foucauldian studies of governmentality is completely absent. After all, it was Foucault himself to underline in Society Must Be Defended the extreme interdependence of biopolitics and thanatopolitics. From my point of view, this necessary interdependence of bio and necropolitics is almost completely absent or underestimated in critical and radical reflection on contemporary global capitalism. Perhaps it is precisely for this reason that racism is almost never on the forefront on present political or theoretical debates on the nature of the global or European regime of migration, government, or on the modalities of class political recomposition. It is now common to stress, for example, the sovereign limits or the eternity of sovereignty of the European process of governmentalization of migration, but racism as a structuring structure both of modern sovereignty and of European dispositive of security, and needless to say of the humanitarian reason, and I don't have time here to say something about this, remains still almost absent in contemporary political debates, where signifiers as borders or boundaries has overtaken and are constantly obscuring the place of racism and anti-racism. Just to reassert that, and now I am concluding, just to reassert that the necropolitical side of Europe has nothing to do with states of exception a la Gamben, or with exceptional places or situations, I would like to conclude retrieving briefly one appreciation by Fanon about the difference between colonies and metropolitan cities. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon has defined the colonial space as a protean and uneven space. In the colony, he reasserts, unlike homogeneous metropolitan territories, slavery, bondage, barter, cottage industries, and stock transaction exist side by side. It could be argued that nowadays this protean and uneven space, this combination of different and hierarchized forms of labor, extends even through the so-called advanced capitalist countries. It is precisely in these terms I suggest to take seriously into consideration racism and necropolitics, to approach them as a primary and constitutive dispositives not only of neoliberal global capital, but mainly of the European post-colonial condition. I believe it is a necessary passage to rethink new modalities of political recomposition, to create or to give theoretical and political stance to new collective and really transversal forms of subjectivation. It is a necessary stand to defend society as a common space. Thank you for your attention.
So we have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Do I have any? Yes, Filippo.
Very good paper. I almost entirely agree with almost everything. I just wanted to come back on the absence of the category racism and even the word itself, racism, from the debate. I think that even from a radical point of view, which is the one in which you place yourself, maybe some nuances will be, I don't know. I mean, I agree that racism is absent. I'm not completely sure that we can throw into the garbage completely the other categories that you mentioned, like xenophobia or Islamophobia. The very same fact that this, for example, just as an example, these two words, Islamophobia and xenophobia, are composed words and can be paired, even if they are not used, with Islamophilia or xenophilia, right? While with racism, there's not this possibility. Even this aspect suggests the possibility of tracing a line between the good subject and the bad subject, the good or the bad foreigner, the good or the bad Muslim. Why the fact that this is not possible with racism maybe flag another problem, which is the problem, and I think we agree on this, which is that in our societies, in our time, we feel immune by the worst crimes and acts that had been done and made in the name of racism, as if those crimes or those situations would not be possible anymore. Thank you. Now, we know this is not the case, right? Yeah. We know that those things are possibly even with us already. However, again, I'm not sure that you can completely throw in the garbage the other categories, and in particular, Islamophobia in these countries. There are issues that, under the folds universal of laicite, for example, specifically target the Muslim subject, which feels and lives this in the ordinary life beyond or below theory, the high theory that we do here, that address them directly. The scarf, of course, is one of them. The pork meat in the school where my kids go. All these issues specifically target that group of people that lives the concept in that way and not through the category of racism. This is not to say that you are wrong, on the contrary, but then maybe those other categories, especially in this society, have a consistency.
No, I know that. The problem is that I have two problems with xenophobia and Islamophobia. I know that they are important, as you were saying. The first is that to speak about xenophobia and Islamophobia put all the problems in a kind of psychological and cultural debate, which is completely abstracted from the real problem. As if people can be Islamophobes or xenophobes also naturally, as if human nature is shaped by this kind of fear of the other. That can be religious, that can be, I don't know, with other color skin. So that's why I don't like them. I mean, I don't like them when they are used completely severed from all this kind of discourse, because they put all the question in a psychological or cultural level. Islamic against Catholic or Christian, or main xenophobia. Berlusconi, for example, in Italy, said 2 or 3 years ago, when he made an alliance with a political alliance with Lega, or with an extreme fascist party, and all the public sphere said, no, but they are very racist. And Berlusconi, very cleverly, he said, no, they are not racist, they are xenophobes. And all of we are xenophobes because fear of the other is something inside the human condition. That's the problem. And the second problem is that I find that we use these adjectives, xenophobes, populists, to define some of the political parties or coalitions or also politicians, just to minimize the problem. Why say xenophobe? They are racist. Why not to say that?
I appreciate very much the criticism that you do to the white Marxism, as you say, to substantialize something and intend racism as the name of something else, as if the problem was copying the old structure, superstructure scheme, right? There's a structure that counts, and then everything else that falls in the superstructure counts, but at a secondary degree. My impression is that sometimes you, trying to avoid this, you fall in the same problem by saying that racism is the only thing that count, as you say, and the rest is not that important in the end. And I think that we should avoid both.
No, of course, yeah. It's only I mean, it's just a performative position to say what I am trying to say about racism, of course. But it's I agree with that. But the fact that racism it's a kind of fatto sociale totale, total social fact, because it involves a plurality of affairs at the same time, as all other dynamics. The problem is that especially in Europe, is something that a big part of the intelligentsia and radical critique don't want to take seriously as a problem. That's my perception.
Katja?
Yeah, I enjoyed to listen to your talk. I have a brief comment and a question. I think it's very fruitful to see how Foucault in Society must defend it tries to answer the question, what happens to the sovereign right to kill in a society which facilitates life. And he says at that point, racism is the structural link to in a society which is kind of fostering life, facilitating life, increasing all capacities of human life to organize and administer death. And the two examples he then brings is National Socialism and the Gulag system as two moments. So the colonial question you put on the agenda today is within a Foucauldian framework a very striking lacuna. So I think regarding my question, I think it would be very interesting to use the question of race in a way Foucault has used the question of sexuality, because sexuality at the end was his tool to see how an individualizing and totalizing elements of administration and discipline kind of intertwine with one another. So that I'm wondering if you work on this to show how the aspect you ended with, uneven spaces. I mean, in a Foucauldian tradition, that would mean not to speak about a total social fact, but racism as a highly differentiated structural tool which cannot be brought on one super effect. I mean, a bit in the direction you mentioned, that we turn the problem on the head and then have to face the same problem again. So that's the question. A brief comment at the end, because I'm a bit troubled with a certain kind of style in thought, which I think comes with a critical whiteness discussion, which initially, through Hill Collins and others, I welcome very much, and I thought this is very productive. But I think there's a certain kind of moral blaming within intellectual work, which all brings the work of the others, like Marxists used to do, that all others are not Marxists. Now the critical whiteness discussion, or the style you spoke about, the work of others, uses again and again, I mean, the moral tone within the critique that the others are not able or just fighting for their own white interests. And I'm not really sure if we not kind of come into in an impasse if we always kind of totalize the situation into, okay, no one speaks about race. I don't think that this is true. I think you are right in showing certain impasses, but if regarding the font of positions you all link together and not being able to see something, I think, and I seeing that hermeneutics of Verdacht, or of suspicion in English, growing a bit at the moment, particularly within that discourse you spoke about today.
Oh, I agree with you in the sense that, of course, sexuality, I think I thought a lot about the connection with race and how it can be used in this scheme. But at the time, I didn't have time to put all the things together. At the time,
No, my question was not, instead of speaking about sexuality as Foucault did, to do this on race.
Okay. At the moment, my purpose is to recall something that Foucault in that book said: the fact that the elimination, segregation, put to death of the other, in some kinds of society, was conceived as a minimal condition of the whole productivity of society. It's not that they are separate. It's not like, for example, Agamben thinks that they are thinking about deceptions. No, it's something necessary. Foucault didn't. He only sketched the relationship between the colonial experience, modernity, and how that intertwining with in the colonies had an effect of retraction on Europe. He only sketched it, but I think that is one of the heritage of the intertwining between capitalism and colonialism. This kind of idea about the necessary production of two kinds of humanity, or to say in another way, a kind of multi-scalar and hierarchized idea of humanity, but which is productive. It's not an excess, it's not something that has to do with sovereign terror. No, it's something more complex and more material. That's only what I am trying to say at the moment. And I can answer you as I answered to Filippo. It's only a performative accent. I don't want to totalize everything, but I want to be direct to say some kind of things to people who sometimes are a bit deaf about these questions. Only that, because if you read this interview, Rancière is one of the main characters of the European radical left intelligentsia, and here in this interview, it's completely out of point from my point of view. But it's not an because there's a real difficulty to put racism as an argument to debate. From my idea is that in traditional radical Western thought, the problem was that sociologists like Vieille-Urquhart, Balibar, Taguieff, but also Rancière, they don't believe in racism. They believe that racism is only mystification, it's something like a lie, something that Le Front National has trying to manipulate the masses. They don't believe. They don't believe as a real social fact. That's the main problem. You don't agree with that?
No, there isn't. Diogo? Yes, for the recording, not for us.
I'm not sure that authors don't believe that racism exists. I think they know it exists, and it produces a lot of discourses and a lot of I agree with you when you present the idea of les valeurs de la République as a form of white supremacy. That's very interesting. It's true. It's not completely true. It's true till a certain extent, because there are probably good things in the idea of the Republic. Although in France it's very hard to say that the Republic was colonialist and so on. So this is still a problem. But what I really wanted to say is that even if you are right, even if there is all this problem with conceptual problem, structural problem with racism in the discourse, in the critical theory, don't you think that we need more different concepts to describe different realities and to describe different discourses also? For instance, the discourse of Front National in France today, it's different from what it was 30 years ago or 20 years ago. If it's enough to say that it's a racist discourse, then we won't be able to describe the differences and why it changed. Also, when you see in Germany today this Alternative für Deutschland, this new party, saying that what Katja mentioned yesterday, Islam doesn't belong to Germany. Okay, we can find the racist Hintergrund, arrière-plan in this discourse, but it's not. Don't you think we need other words to describe in a more precise way different discourses and different realities? That would be on my point, actually.
Yes, of course. I don't want to reduce all to racism, because as many authors in the Black American tradition has said, racism has to be seen. Better, racist discourses are always over-determined, we could say in an Althusserian way, by the particular historical, geographical condition in which that discourse emerged. So it couldn't be the same today in France that 100 years ago in Australia, or today in South Europe as in Northern Europe. I don't know. Of course, yes, and we need more concepts. Necro Politics, I think, is one of them, which can be very useful to build a kind of general theory as a start point for all this analysis. But I agree with you, because racism is not monolithic and ahistorical, and also because it has always to answer to the anti-racist struggles. We'd always put new problems to the way in which racism must again grip society. So, yes.
Okay, can you join me in thanking Miguel Mellino for his paper today? Provocateur.